Welcome to the fifth episode of our weekly El-Monitor webinar series on the Israel-Hamas war and its impact on the region. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of El-Monitor. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, following his trip to the region, has said that Israel should not reoccupy Gaza after the military operation against Hamas, and that the Palestinian Authority should be responsible for governance. His remarks show signs of divisions between the Biden administration and the Israeli government on the post-Gaza situation. To discuss all of the latest, we have with us Dr. Shibley Telhami, professor, University of Maryland. He's also director of the Critical Issues Poll and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we also have with us El-Monitor associate editor for Israeli coverage, Rina Bassist. Thank you both for being with us today. To our viewers, please submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Shibley, let's start with you. Your latest poll, which shows that, and I'm quoting from it, or quoting from you, that change among young Democrats has been particularly notable since the war began. They are now twice as likely to view President Biden as, quote, too pro-Israeli than they were in October before the conflict started. The number of those saying they would be less likely to vote for Biden because of his stance on the Israeli-Palestinian issue has more than doubled since then, and those who want the United States to lean toward the Palestinians have measurably increased. Tell us about this poll. How do you see it playing out? And put it in the context of other things we're seeing in U.S. politics, which is the censorship of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American serving in the Congress, for her support for a ceasefire and in support of dealing with the Palestinian issue.
Thank you, first of all, for hosting me. I really appreciate that. And I'm pleased to join Rina in this conversation. Let me put the polling in context. As you know, I do polling on this issue. I've been doing it for decades, literally. I think the first one I did was in the late 1980s. That dates me, obviously, quite a bit. But I do some tracking questions. So when the war started, when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, I designed just a brief questions to track them over time. And when I say I designed questions, I actually tried to track ones we'd already asked in the past. So we didn't really want to ask directly about the war. We just wanted to see if the war is changing attitudes, including attitudes we had measured before the war. So we have a sense of the impact without really asking them, what do you think about the war? So we didn't really ask questions directly about the war. It was about attitude. So we had three questions. One that we asked over time, which is, do you want the U.S. to lean toward Israel, toward the Palestinians, or toward neither side? It's a very generic question. And one about whether the Biden administration, they see it as being too pro-Palestinian, too pro-Israeli, or about right. And one question about whether the Biden administration's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian issue is likely to make them vote for him more or less. And so those are really the tracking questions that we had. And the first one we did actually, Andrew, was not immediately before the war. It was actually after the war. So we did one 2 weeks after the war. And in that one, where obviously the first week was very much focused on the horror of the Hamas attack on Israel, the victims of that attack, the civilian victims and so forth. And with a lot of American official public support, there was actually a bump favoring Israel 2 weeks after the war. So there was an increase, a marked increase. I would say even the largest poll-to-poll increase we have measured in years. So we had, more people across the board, more Democrats, more independents, more Republicans than before the war said they now wanted the U.S. to lean toward Israel. Nonetheless, a majority of Democrats and independents wanted the U.S. to take neither side. So we're talking about minority support, but significantly increased minority support. Young people 2 weeks after the war had not changed their attitudes at all. since the last poll, which was in June. We did a poll in June. So the young people, 2 weeks after the war, young people had not changed. Young Democrats had not changed their views. They were identical to the ones back in June. 2 weeks later, just in the past weekend, which is basically a month into the war, we did a follow-up poll asking the same questions. And then we saw another large shift, but this time, much of the gain that Israel made after 2 weeks had disappeared, especially among Democrats. And so there was a drop in the support for Israel that we saw in the middle of October, but it was especially impactful on young Democrats, people who are under 35. That's how we define young Democrats in this poll. And there we have seen quite a bit of a shift, where there were more Democrats said they want the U.S. to lean toward Palestinians than before. The support for Israel remained roughly the same within the margin of error, but there was a marked increase, particularly among young Democrats who said the U.S., the Biden administration leans too much, is too pro-Israel. As you had said in your comment, that was double the number that had said that in October. And to put that in perspective, that's a majority of those who answered the question, because you had more than a third of Democrats who said they didn't know where the Biden administration stood on this. But among those who said they knew, almost 3/4 of young Democrats said that it's too pro-Israel, and a big increase from what it was just 2 weeks before. The more troubling for the Biden administration is that across the board, in both polls actually, including the first one, there was a bump for Israel. More people said they're less likely to vote for him than more likely to vote for him across the overall in the American poll. But this time, among young Democrats, it was really quite striking. It was 21% said they're less likely to vote for him. Only 8% said they're more likely to vote for him, and that's really troubling for him politically. So I think. Clearly, this is a fluid situation. We don't really know where it's going to, end, because you see it bumping up and down, as you could see in those 2 polls. It is telling us that the Hamas attack did not really create a paradigm shift in opinion. It was a bump of sympathy because it pretty much, most of it disappeared. Much of it, not most of it, most of it among Democrats, but much of it among independents and Republicans. It telling you this is a fluid situation. So we don't know what's going to. We're going to keep tracking it and see whether certain segments of the public will have hardened views based on the images that they're watching. Sometimes we have what we call paradigm forming moment, where you really have hardened views. It's like stamp on their consciousness, and it becomes sort of the way they evaluate the conflict. We don't know yet whether we're going to see that moment.
Rina, I mentioned at the beginning Secretary Blinken's remarks about current U.S. thinking about the post-war situation in Gaza. Are you seeing divisions between the Biden administration and the government of Israel in thinking about the post-war situation? And could you give us your analysis and insight into the current state of thinking about the post-war situation, and how deep are these divisions, and what do they mean for the U.S.-Israel engagement on the war?
Yes, first of all, if we want to talk about divisions, then we need to know that the Israeli government has a stance, has a clear thinking of what will be that day after. I'm not sure we are there yet. First of all, we have to say that Israeli society and the government are completely in a war mode situation. So it's very difficult, I think, for the Israelis to think what will happen after. And also very important to note is that the day after, what does it mean? We have actually 2 days after. We have the immediate day after, which is once the ground offensive is over, at the moment when Israel has to decide what to do, to stay or to leave. And then we have, of course, the bigger day after, the moment Israel will have to rethink again the issue of the Palestinian question, the two-state solution and so on. I think it's obvious to everybody that this second day after, Israel is not ready to face it for the moment for several reasons. First of all, we don't know what sort of government would be in the days after the war. Once the war is over, it is very likely that there will be a committee or a commission of inquiry, that the government would change, that we will have new elections. So we're not sure yet which sort of government we will have in Israel at that time and what mandate the government will have from the Israeli public to discuss this bigger, grander day after. That's one element. And the second element is, of course, the feeling within the Israeli society, for the moment at least, in the days after October 7th, that there is no partner on the Palestinian side because of the great disappointment within Israel that Mr. Mahmoud Abbas did not really condemn the attack by Hamas and did not say this is not our way, this is this is unproductive for the Palestinian cause. This is not representative of the Palestinian cause for statehood. So that's for the bigger day after. But if we go really for the post-war, for the immediate moments once the ground offensive is over, I think we have seen that the last visit of Mr. Blinken in Israel, a great push from the Biden administration on Israel to take a stand. Now, what are the possible solutions? We can see we have, of course, the easiest in the way solution is for the Palestinian Authority to take over. And we have heard the head of the opposition, Mr. Yair Lapid, saying that this is the solution he believes in. He believes legally the Palestinian Authority does have already also legal authority over the Gaza Strip. So that could be in a way an easy solution which Israel could accept. But of course, Mahmoud Abbas, for the moment, he's not ready to engage. The second solution, and we heard some reports in Israel, though the government never confirmed that Mr. Netanyahu was pushing for the Egyptians to engage, and we have seen that also in the visit of chief of the CIA. The Egyptians, for their own reason, are very reluctant to engage in that, which leaves us with a third option, the UN. But as you must know, there is a great mistrust in Israel vis-a-vis the United Nations, vis-a-vis Mr. Guterres. I think that the day after Israel, the Israeli government at some point will have to accept some sort of a solution that would combine the Palestinian Authority and the UN, some sort of maybe a common force or something of that sort that would rule the Gaza Strip, at least for a certain period of time. That's the only solution I think that the Israeli public could accept. But then, of course, Israel will have to pay, if I can use that word, Israel will have to pay in gestures, in significant gestures for the Palestinians, for Mr. Mahmoud Abbas to accept such a solution.
Shibley, let me pick up on what Rina was saying and ask the question to you this way. Secretary Blinken, again, said that the PA should have this role in post-war Gaza. Rina explained how that is being considered on the Israeli side. But President Abbas seemed less than interested, especially in the immediate day after, the first day after, as Rina said. What role do you see for the PA? And do you believe that given their current situation, where their popularity has been on decline in the West Bank, that they're prepared to assume that type of role in Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter, after the conflict?
First of all, we're very far away from the day after, if there is a day after. We have no idea how this is going to end. And anybody who thinks they do, I don't think understands the environment in which we're operating. For one thing, I don't really know what destroying Hamas means. To me, if it's achievable at all, and I'm not sure it is, it means destroying all of Gaza. So you have a destroyed Gaza, with a population of nearly 2 million people. The entire population of Gaza is 2.3. You already have 1.5 million displaced people. And I'm not sure that is, I don't know whether that will happen because I think the pressure for a ceasefire will increase despite of the denial now. So I'm not really sure that we're going to have quite an end where Israel controls and Hamas is gone. The second reason is I don't preclude escalation at this point. I think if we are talking about completely destroying Hamas and therefore destroying much of Gaza in the process, it is hard for me to see that Hezbollah can stay out, even though they prefer to stay out. It is hard for me to see that Iran could stay out if Hezbollah gets in. It's hard for me to see that the U.S. could be out. So I think the escalation, despite all of the promises and the assessments, are there. I think they're built into this process now. Very hard to avoid. If I was in Hezbollah's position saying that Israel is going to do all that destruction, including destroying my ally Hamas, they might turn after they're free of Hamas and come to hit me. Do I want to wait for the moment for them to choose the moment that they want to attack me? I think it's an unstable process and assessment, Hezbollah and Israel right now. So I don't think we're anywhere near knowing how this is going to end or what the opening will be. So let's keep that in mind, because I think we ought to be very modest about our assessment and our certainty about how this is going to end, if it ends at all, if it's just not an ongoing conflict and fighting. As for the PA, though, I think it is, remember, the PA before this started was increasingly considered illegitimate by the Palestinians, very weak, seen mostly as a subcontractor for Israeli security and provider of services. This war has made it even more marginalized in Palestinian eyes. Oddly enough, though, it enhanced its importance internationally because everyone wants to look at an alternative to Hamas. So they want to have some party to turn to as an alternative. And so they go back to an authority that they have weakened over the time. Everybody has weakened, the international community, the Israelis. And so they're expecting this weakened authority that had, that was completely delegitimized even before the war, further delegitimized by the war, to somehow go into a destroyed Gaza with passionate new refugees, including many young ones who will become more militant, to go in there on the back of Israeli tanks, and they think that's going to solve the problem. I mean, it is just something that I cannot imagine. I think the only and so when you say the Palestinian authorities are reluctant, they know what they're up against, and they're tying it into a statehood. Well, if the U.S. says we're going to recognize a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital now, and the Palestinian Authority will recognize it as the leaders of the new emerging state, and both Gaza and the West Bank, I mean, that of course would be completely different. I don't see that happening politically for the United States. I don't see that happening politically in Israel. As Rina said, it's very unclear how the Israeli political picture is going to be shaped in the coming weeks and months. So we're way too early, and I am fearful that all this talk about the day after is a smokescreen to take us away from the reality that remains horrendous, endless right now. And that's what we ought to be focused on. How do we end this nightmare right now, rather than just thinking about a day after as if there's some hope around. Remember, we started off with a completely hopeless situation. It isn't like before Hamas attacked, this horrible attack. The Palestinians were in good shape, whether it was in Gaza or the West Bank. It's a 56-year occupation in the West Bank. Gaza was under a blockade, a complete blockade. I, as you know, wrote a book edited book with several colleagues saying the one-state reality. We considered it to be one-state reality. We're less optimistic about two states. That's pervasive in the West Bank and Gaza. The pessimism about the Palestinian state. And you think that Biden, President Biden, who now is probably more disliked in the Arab world and among Palestinians than Benjamin Netanyahu. Hard to do. They don't trust him, particularly given the posture that he's taken now. You think they're going to trust his promises that they're going to work toward a two-state solution? You think anybody is going to take any of this seriously in the political process? So I think, we are really kind of playing with words here. And I think in the process, we may be distracting, as I said, from an incredibly awful reality that we all must work to bring to an end. The sooner, the better.
Just a reminder to our viewers, we already have a list of questions I'm going to get to momentarily. But Rina, I wanted to come back to you. You are covering Gaza Aid Conference in France today. Maybe you could pick up on what Shibley was saying about the uncertainty about the post-war situation and how the politics of what we're seeing and where the war is at this point is playing into what's happening in Paris at the Aid Conference.
No, definitely. And you asked me before, Andrew, about the role Israel, the U.S. is playing and how Israel feels about it. So far from the beginning of this war, we have seen mostly the Americans taking front stage vis-a-vis Egypt, vis-a-vis the Palestinians, vis-a-vis Qatar, vis-a-vis different players in the region. And now we see also the Europeans, mainly France and President Macron, who are also entering into this game. And France is actually focusing on the humanitarian side. So the conference that was today, that started this morning in Paris at the Élysée Palace, was focusing on the very pragmatic sides of how to get humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And very interesting, the French president not only pledged to offer the Gazans 80 more million euros in aid. So that makes the total French assistance 100 million euros in aid. But he also called not only for a humanitarian pause, which has been discussed over the last few days, but also, and that's new for the Europeans, also for a humanitarian ceasefire. I think he could do it. He could present this demand in view of the audience he had, because neither the Hamas nor the Israelis were in fact invited to participate in that. We do have still the Palestinian Prime Minister, Mr. Shatia, who is in Paris, who is participating. We have some other representatives from the region as well. I might also add, very interesting, the Americans are not quite sure how well this initiative was received in Washington, because the Biden administration chose to send only an undersecretary to this event, while other countries send either prime minister or a foreign minister. It might be that the Americans feel that France, the Europeans, are sort of trying to interfere with the negotiations they're holding for a humanitarian pause. That I don't know. We will have to wait and see. But for the moment, since Israel was not invited to this event, Israel stays very quiet on it.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to our questions. The first one for you, Shibley. You talked about polling of under 35 in the United States and their views of the conflict. What are you seeing with regard to reactions among young people under 35 throughout the Arab world? Prior to this conflict, it seemed that the Israeli-Palestinian issue was less of a priority for them. Is that changing as a result of this war?
This is really a good question. I have, for a decade, I did a lot of Arab public opinion polling, but that ended pretty much in 2012. So I did that really mostly after 9/11 through the next decade, when the Arab uprising started. So I haven't been doing polling, but I have been, of course, probing, reading other polls that have come out on it. And I have also assessed public opinion in other ways, including social media. I wrote, in fact, a chapter on that in our new book, the One State Reality. My assessment is that there wasn't as big a difference between young people and old people with regard to the Palestine question over the years. What happened across the entire Arab world after the Arab uprisings is there were so many immediate priorities for the Arab publics. Look at what happened in Iraq after the war, for example, before even the Arab uprisings, but in places like Syria, in places like Yemen, in places like Libya, and in Egypt as well. You had, obviously, it wasn't as much violence. For sure, it was a different kind of environment, but nonetheless, it was massive and polarizing. So in some ways, particularly after the what we call the counter-revolution, so to speak, when the Arab rulers decided to fight back against the Arab uprisings and defend themselves, they saw the Palestinian issue as one that mobilizes opposition. So they deliberately worked to limit its impact in their own public. And whether or not that worked, I don't think it has. And we see a lot of analysis that I provide elsewhere that suggests that the Arab public opinion remained caring about Palestine. There was no shift in their support for Palestine, but there was a diminishing of the prioritizing of Palestine because they had more immediate issues to focus on. And there wasn't anything that is erupting every day to generate mobilization. I think that's probably what gave the window of opportunity for the Abraham Accords, for also talk about a Saudi-Israeli deal that bypasses the Palestinians. This eruption clearly has shifted the focus. We see it. And I think, in my own opinion, I use the term paradigm forming or paradigm shifting. In the case of our own public, I don't know this is necessarily going to be paradigm forming or shifting. In the Arab world, my thought right now is this is probably a moment that is going to be seared on the consciousness of the new generation of Arabs and many Muslims around the world, perhaps even many in the global South. And so that clearly creates a raising of the priorities of this issue in ways we have not seen. And it does impact directly or indirectly the position of the governments. It's not that it shifts their strategic interest in wanting, let's say, to Arab governments, most of them don't like Hamas, for example. They, in a way, they prefer that Hamas not be a winner or seen as a winner, whatever happens on the ground, in part because they see it as mobilizing opposition to them. They see it as ally of Iran, which, of course, they see mostly as a state that they want to contain and weaken rather than strengthening. So that doesn't change the picture there, but it limits their maneuverability for sure. And I think we're going to see that in the coming months.
Rina, a question for you. Will Prime Minister Netanyahu survive the war as Prime Minister?
It's a tough question. I think not. I think the sentiment within the Israeli public is very strong. If you compare it maybe to the Yom Kippur War, to the 73 war, and the political repercussions of that war on Golda Meir, on other political personalities, at the time, the Israeli leadership said, we didn't understand that we were not security experts, the army didn't warn us, etc., etc. Mr. Netanyahu cannot say he's not a security expert. He built his political career on that, on being Mr. Security. For many years, he has served in an elite unit. He has built also his image on this, I don't want to use the name, the word brand, but the fact that his brother was killed saving the hostages at the Entebbe operation. So Mr. Netanyahu cannot say that the military failure, that the intelligence failure, and also the failure of the whole concept, the concept of strengthening Hamas, of dialoguing with Hamas, negotiating with Hamas, that's on him. So these are three big failures. I find it very hard to believe that Mr. Netanyahu could survive these failures politically. And the fact is that in order to manage this war, it was very clear to him that he had to bring in to his government elements from the opposition. He needed to bring in Mr. Gantz, and he needed to bring in Mr. Eisenkot, because these are people that come from the center. They are credible in the eyes of the Israelis. They are also credible in the eyes, I think, of the Biden administration, which is also something that the Israelis do not neglect. Mr. Netanyahu, I think, has lost most of his credibility already before the war, vis-a-vis the Biden administration, and definitely now. So if I come back to it, it would be very difficult to see how he could survive it, and how he could survive also the commission of inquiry that is surely set to come.
There have been a further question. There have been the questions raised by both the Biden administration and those in Israel about the reliability of statistics by the Ministry of Health in Gaza about the number of Palestinians killed. Shibley, let me ask you, are those statistics reliable based upon what we know from conflicts in the past, and how is that being played? It seems to me that Biden's remarks on this were not received well.
All right, let me start, before I talk about the facts, let me start to Biden's comments, which seem to say this is the cost of war after thousands had been killed and wounded, and many, hundreds of thousands being displaced, and dismissing that as that's what happens in war, and then dismissing the numbers, served, I think, as dehumanizing of the Palestinians. And I think it went against his message at home, which was a message against anti-Palestinian sentiment, anti-Semitism sentiment, and anti-Islam Muslim sentiment, because these, form opinions. And I think clearly they created a backlash among Palestinians and the world. It was just insensitivity that's remarkable, that those of us who've known the president, I think both of us have known him before he became president, we're really shocked that he would, particularly as a Democratic president, say that publicly. As to the facts, we already know. I mean, most international organizations, human rights organizations, have tracked it over the years, and saw after the fact what actually happened, and weighed the facts against the statements from the health ministry in Gaza, have seen no significant differences. And the Washington Post fact checker last week did a full analysis, check it with Glenn Kessler, as he does a very fabulous job following on fact checking. He did a fact checking of this and found that the president had no reason to be so skeptical about the Palestinian casualties. In fact, the White House spokesman Kirby is quoted, I think this morning or yesterday, in The Hill, saying that the casualties may actually be larger than have been reported after all this is said and done. So clearly, that was a bad comment by the president that set a wrong tone, and I wish they would take it back, but certainly he hasn't done so.
Rina, would you like to pick up on that and how this issue is playing out in Israel, and in the context of the film that's been shown to some in the media? I haven't seen it. I don't know if you have, that documents many of the Hamas terrorist atrocities when they crossed into Israel on October 7th and murdered 1,400 Israelis. Could you comment on how the sensitivity of this issue and the feelings in Israel regarding both concerns about reports of the casualties on the Palestinian side, and that perhaps people have forgotten about how terrible the Hamas attack on October 7th was?
Yes, maybe I'll start with the film and the fact that in the past 4 weeks or so, since October 7, Israeli authorities, apart from the film, which actually brings live footage filmed by Hamas, terrorists by Hamas assailants, showing what they did, Israeli authorities have also registered and collected over 700 testimonies of what happened on that terrible day. So I think that everything that went on the 7th of October, we have a rather clear idea, which is backed, first of all, by this terrible film, by the videos shot by the attackers themselves, and backed, on the other hand, by all the testimonies of those who survived. So I think on what happened on October 7, we have this very clear, terrible idea of what happened. Now, going back to the numbers on the Palestinian side, and I'm not going to dispute the numbers because, of course, every civilian that is killed is terrible. So the idea is not so much to dispute the numbers, but I would say, I would maybe take us back to the incident of the Gaza hospital that was targeted by, maybe accidentally, by a rocket shot by the Islamic Jihad. And we remember very well that Hamas at the beginning claimed that 500 people were killed. Looking back, and I'm not talking about the Israeli assessment, I'm really talking about assessments coming from the Pentagon and coming also from European intelligence services, are saying that the number was between 50 and 100. And also we remember that the Israeli army took 2 hours to react to that, being very, very careful. And there was a price, of course. These 2 hours, there was a price to pay. And the price to pay is that once the scenario is out, then it's out. It's very difficult to bring it back, even though you can bring all sorts of evidence and recordings and photos to show that the reality was not the same reality that was presented. And I would also add that I think the fact that the Israelis are not presenting their own numbers, are not presenting any assessments of the casualties, it goes along with this careful approach of saying, what we can't verify, it's better not to enter into discussion. And I think we should be very, very careful about the numbers presented by the Gaza Ministry of Health, because we know that the Gaza Ministry of Health is run has its own interest. And for me, it's very difficult to take at face value the numbers that they are presenting.
But I would say just look at the report of independence. We're not talking about Hamas or Israel reporting. We're talking about what the international organizations that accumulate those numbers and the overtime record of whether the health ministry's estimates tend to be verified. Over time, they have been verified. Look at the Washington Post fact checker on the hospital. Look at the New York Times assessment that's independent from the U.S. government assessment about what actually happened and what may have resulted, which is still uncertain, but may have resulted in the explosion of the hospital. So there's been a lot of things that, and no one has presented anything with certainty related to that at this point. It's all speculative based on some indirect, some information that we have. So I think we have to be careful not to just make sweeping statements about you can't trust when we actually have methods of verifying over time.
We are almost out of time, but I want to get 2 more questions in from our viewers. And if your answers could be brief, I know they're big questions we have left, but that's why I wanted to ask them. Coming back to your initial remarks, Shibley, about polling in the United States, while yes, there seems to be increasing concern among the under 35 set about the Biden administration's position, isn't this at the margins? Because what you see are the Biden administration, Democrat and Republican elites, for the most part, rallying around the president's policy in support of Israel?
I think it goes, first of all, beyond Democrats. I know what the official positions are, but at the public opinion, look, we have seen over time, regardless of what the war situation is, we have seen so many polls that have indicated increasing sympathy for the Palestinians prior to the war because of the continuing occupation. The Gallup poll last year, which had certainly measured more sympathy for Palestinians than for Israel. Our poll had a measured shift across the Democratic constituency, not just young people. The young people have been the strongest shift. The question is, in a close election, whether in fact the president himself can afford losing even 5% of Democrats, let alone 10% or 20%. And we have seen coincidentally with the war that the president's approval rating among Democrats went down substantially. It isn't likely that all of this comes because of the war, but it's possible that some of it comes from the war. We did a similar one in 2021, correlated with the Gaza war, where there was also a general drop in the president's approval ratings during the same time. So I think it is. I think it is consequential. I think actually my own assessment is the president's posture on the war is likely to hurt him politically. Obviously we don't, between now and the election, there's a full year, so we obviously there's a lot of time for things to change. But I think if the elections were held today, I believe that his posture on the war would hurt him. There are many Democrats, of course, who are, and that's what he's betting on. I don't want to criticize him because they don't want to weaken him. They don't want Trump, obviously, to be elected. I spoke to two congressional leaders over the past week, both of them Democrats, and both of them are not very happy about the administration posture on this issue, but both said they're not going to take him on publicly because they have the dilemma of wanting to not wanting to weaken a Democratic president during a close election year. The question is whether there will be some people who are so angered that they will sit out the election, or they will not be energized enough to do what they need to do for the president to win. Or they will, vote for a third party, which obviously is be disastrous from the point of view of preventing Trump. But we all know that politics is not a straightforward calculus of self-interest. There's some protest votes, there's some identity votes, there are all kinds of reasons why people vote. It isn't all about self-interest. And so I think my own assessment where I'm sitting, I think so far the president posture on this war is hurting him politically if elections were to be held today.
And Rina, we are just about out of time, so very quickly, but I wanted to ask you one more question about the war on Israel's domestic politics. Why didn't Yair Lapid and his party join the unity government initiative as Gantz did? And how do you see Lapid's role?
It's a very good question. I think that the answer is very simple. He does not trust Mr. Netanyahu. He does not trust Mr. Netanyahu to really take his opinion in the decisions how to run the war. And he probably does not trust Netanyahu to take his opinion into account when deciding what we spoke about before the day after. And that's why he would not take the political responsibility of entering this cabinet of war. And I think all Israeli leaders have in mind what will happen once the offensive ends, and each person will have to take responsibility for what happened. And this is Mr. Lapid's way of taking responsibility.
And over time, this was a great discussion. I want to thank you, Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Chair at the University of Maryland, Rina Bassist, El Monitor Associate Editor, leading our Israel coverage. Thank you both. Thanks to our viewers. Great question. We'll be back again next week in our series, and you can continue to read El Monitor's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war and all of the news and trends in the Middle East at elmonitor.com. Thank you.
Thank you.